Hello. I was going to talk about the Gothic Revival movement in the 19th century, but the more I thought about the word Gothic, the more my thoughts expanded to cover a wide range of both positive and negative meanings associated with Gothic. So I've expanded the talk to cover what I'm calling the history of Gothic and its revival. The original meaning referred to the Goths. That was a Latin term for Germanic tribesmen. And this is a depiction of a Gothic warrior battling Roman cavalry from a 3rd century sarcophagus. The Goths were, of course, the ancient Germanic tribes that played a significant role in the sack of Rome in 410 and the subsequent fall of the Western Roman Empire. Now, Gothic architecture and art was a term applied in scorn by Italian Renaissance artists to describe what, quote, the monstrous and barbarous architecture, which is the way they saw the art of the medieval period. This is Lincoln Cathedral, consecrated in the 11th century. The Gothic Revival is in the 19th century. It was a renewed interest in the Gothic style, and it became a positive term in the 18th and 19th century Britain because it was seen to embody English history, noble virtues. This is the rebuilt Palace of Westminster. Gothic horror and the Gothic novel had many associations, including negative meanings, horror, witches, evil, and so on. And then finally, recently, Gothic horror combining positive and negative associations in the way it deals with dark and mysterious forces, themes of alienation, melancholy, the nature of existence, and so on, in music such as Black Sabbath and films such as Apocalypse Now. So let's go back to not the Goths that sacked Rome, but to Gothic art and architecture. The term Gothic was, as far as we can tell, first used in a letter by Raphael to Pope Leo X to refer, as I said, to the monstrous and barbarous art of the medieval period. And in fact, Raphael pointed out that the pointed arches, that this is Wells Cathedral, and I've selected this picture, as you can see, the pointed Gothic doorway. He described the pointed arches of northern architecture as echoes of the primitive huts the Germanic forest dwellers formed by bending trees together. So that's the way that he saw it, a sort of a very primitive idea compared with the rounded Roman arches. In fact, the pointed arch is an advance on the curved Roman arch as it supports a far greater load. But for the Italians, the word Gothic was synonymous with barbaric because they associated the medieval period with the sack of Rome by the Visigoths, followed by 1,000 years of what they saw as the Dark Ages. And they saw themselves as recreating the wonders and the achievements of the classical world, literally a rebirth of everything that was great about the Roman Empire and the Greeks, and everything in between was simply barbarous. Even things like this tapestry is a late 15th century, and such works as this were either unknown, disregarded, or belittled. So this is Lincoln Cathedral, consecrated in 1091, and the 19th century had a very different view from the Italian Renaissance. In fact, the famous 19th century art critic John Ruskin wrote, "I have always held that the Cathedral of Lincoln is out and out the most precious piece of architecture in the British Isles, and roughly speaking, worth any two other cathedrals we have." And in Northern Europe, during the late medieval period, people admired these Gothic cathedrals, put vast resources into building them, and they were known as opus modernum, modern works. For them, the cathedrals were God's work, an image of the heavenly Jerusalem that they were privileged to build on earth with their soaring columns and spectacular stained glass. It was an achievement of a technological achievement as well as a religious achievement. The flying buttresses enabled the windows to be made larger. Here I've got one picture of the flying buttresses on the chapter house of Lincoln Cathedral. And the pointed windows and flying buttresses enabled what you see here, light-filled soaring spaces. And the Gothic is also defined by this ribbed vaulting rather than the barrel vaulting of Romanesque churches. This, by the way, is again Lincoln Cathedral, and it's the so-called crazy ribbed vaulting, lit by the windows at the top, which are the clerestory windows, and below them the triforium. And this is St. Hugh's choir, one of the earliest examples of English Gothic style. The crazy rib vaulting, by the way, is the earliest example of tierceron vault, which has, as you can see, 3 ribs springing from a pillar on one side and either side of the window on the other. And I'll be recording a separate talk on Gothic architecture. So let's move on with this idea of the Gothic and the way that that word was used and interpreted. This is the darker side. This is an illustration of the Dance Macabre, or Dance of Death. It was produced to remind everyone of the shortness of life and the vanity of early earthly glories and riches. And typically, these Dance Macabres featured a pope, an emperor, a king, a child and a labourer, making the point that everyone is equal before death. And in fact, the Dance Macabre was reenacted at village pageants and at court masques, with people dressing up as corpses from various strata of society. It may be that it was a response to the many horrors of the 14th century, such as the famines, the 100 Years' War with France, and most of all, of course, the Black Death, which killed perhaps 50 million people, up to half the population of Europe. And it just shows how terrible a pandemic can be. It brought far-reaching economic and social changes. Many thought the Black Death was God's retribution on a sinful society, and many feared the devil and those regarded as the devil's agents, namely witches, and ideas about black magic and witchcraft permeated society at all levels. One pivotal text of 1486 was called the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, and it was a treatise that provided a sort of framework for identifying, prosecuting and punishing witches. It was written by a Catholic clergyman called Heinrich Kramer. Now, painted images of witches are rare, but Hans Baldung, who was, by the way, considered the most gifted student of Albrecht Dürer, Baldung was the first German artist to heavily incorporate witches and witchcraft and erotic themes into his artwork. The text at the bottom of this picture, I don't know how to interpret it. It's a bit of a joke, I assume. It reads, Der Chorkarpen in gut Jahr, or ein gut Jahr, to the cleric a good year. And it's like a New Year's card. And it refers to the fact that the imagination of certain clergymen didn't always turn to witches with moral disgust. This is a later painting called Witches at Their Incantations by Salvatore Rosa, 1646. Now, he rarely painted common religious subjects unless they had a landscape element. He liked to produce battle scenes, allegories, self-portraits, and as here, scenes of witches and witchcraft. He was reacting against the doctrine of ideal beauty, and he often showed grotesque, monstrous, deformed people. And remember, this was a time when there was a strong interest in alchemy and sorcery. And we see here spells are being cast in the centre below a man hanged from a withered tree. There's a brightly illuminated foreground and a dark nocturnal landscape behind. There's a giant skeleton. It sort of reminds me of a dinosaur, but I don't know if Salvatore Rosa had ever seen such a skeleton. There's a naked witch in the centre mixing some sort of revolting soup. There's a knight with a flaming torch to the right. A figure covered in a shroud. A person on the left being made to sign a document. And there's a witch cutting the toe off the hanged man, perhaps to put in the soup. 1762, so moving on over 100 years, this is William Hogarth, Credulity, Superstition and Fanaticism. By this stage, the witches and everything associated with them were treated as comic characters and used as symbols of irrationality and superstition. The last execution of a witch in England was 1684. That's shortly before Hogarth was born. So when he produced this illustration, it was some time previously. This is an attack on irrational belief in all of its forms. It was a time, by the way, when, if you look at the top, the Methodist preacher in his right hand is holding the conventional image of a witch that we still have today, that was invented at this time, with a pointed hat, a broomstick and a black cat. Hogarth is lampooning the exaggerated emotions of the Methodist movement. The sermons were so emotional, they so moved the members of the congregation, that sometimes at the end of the sermon people would try to kill themselves. And Methodists believed in witches and demons. This contrast with, if you look at the window, the left window, you'll see a Muslim staring through the window, amazed at the way Christians are behaving. And so he represents the rational, enlightened part of mankind, looking down on Christian fanatics with surprise and disgust. And the various figures in the room represent more than a dozen stories of witchcraft or possession. some of the congregation, you'll notice, are gnawing at icons of Christ. They're taking transubstantiation to an extreme, an irrational extreme. Below the pulpit, there's an aristocrat pushing an icon of the Cock Lane ghost down the shirt of a young lady, or the bodice of a young lady who's in the throes of religious ecstasy. And a common accusation against Methodist preachers was that they used religion to seduce female adherents who became overcome with emotion. You can see this on the right is a thermometer. It's the thing at the bottom is a brain measuring the temperature of her passions with lust highlighted. The woman with rabbits running out from under her skirt is a reference to Mary Toft from Godalming, who in 1726 was supposed to have given birth to a litter of 16 rabbits and a tabby cat. And to her right, to the right, is a shoeblack who's vomiting nails and pins, again a reference to another well-known fraud, the boy of Bilson, who ate metal items. Now the excuse me, the 18th century was the age of enlightenment, and science was slowly providing rational explanations for many phenomena previously regarded as supernatural. This, of course, is by Joseph Wright of Derby, an experiment on a bird in the air pump, 1768. And the experiment is being conducted by a natural philosopher, a forerunner of modern scientists. He was part showman, part knowledgeable lecturer, and such people were in high demand. They toured the country. They would present their experiments in the houses of the wealthy and in village halls. The unusual lighting here and the strongly side-lit faces is suggesting the supernatural, a style that has been called neo-Gothic. It combines a fear of the unknown with the bright light of enlightenment. The experiment being shown here is a recreation of one of Robert Boyle's air pump experiments. A bird, which you can see at the top, is being deprived of air before a varied group of onlookers, and you can see various reactions in the audience. Scientific curiosity, concerns for the bird. Incidentally, the bird shown here in the painting was a cockatoo, a very rare bird, and one whose life would never in reality have been risked in an experiment like this. The painting has become, I think, his best known work, and was described as one art historian as one of the wholly original masterpieces of British art. Another one by Wright of Derby. Now, when Wright went to Italy in 1774, he left this Gothic painting to be exhibited at the Society of Artists, but it failed to sell. It's the story of an old man suddenly accosted by a skeleton in broad daylight, and perhaps it didn't sell because it was regarded as just too strange. There was a lot of interest in the Gothic, but it was said at the time that this painting was just too Gothic for polite audiences. It's actually one of Aesop's original fables, and it tells how a poor woodman, overwhelmed by the burdens of age and work, lay down his bundle of sticks and calls upon death to ease his woes. When death duly arrives, armed with an arrow, the terrified woodman politely asks him for help to pick up his bundle, and the artist here has emphasised the old man's fear by having him shrink back away from the skeleton, extending his arm as though to push away the skeleton. The moral of the fable has been translated as, man any miseries will endure rather than seek from death a cure. This is Henry Fuseli's The Nightmare, 1781. Now, the Romantic movement was partly a reaction against the strict rationality of neoclassical art, and the Romantic movement was associated with Gothic Revival. But there was also a darker side, which was associated with a lack of restraint, with violence, passion, ghosts, satanic practices. And you can see that shown here in this painting by Fuseli. Incidentally, many critics at the time found this work scandalous because of its sexual associations, although it's now his best known work. Now, on the back of this painting, there's another painting, portrait of a young woman, and it's been suggested that the painting, The Nightmare, is autobiographical and represents Fuseli's suppressed lust for a woman called Anna Landholt, a young woman he fell passionately in love with in 1779, and she was the niece of his friend Felix Lavater. And Fuseli wrote to his friend, he wrote a letter which contains the passage, "Last night I had her in bed with me, tossed my bedclothes hugger-mugger, wound my hot and tight-clasped hands about her, fused her body and soul together with my own, poured into her my spirit, breath and strength. Anyone who touches her now commits adultery and incest. She is mine, and I am hers, and have her I will." End quote. However, an extraordinary letter to write to the niece of the woman, Anna Landholt. The love, however, was one-sided and came to nothing. But what I'm saying is, the reason I read that out is it may have been the inspiration for this painting. Philip James de Lautherberg, Coalbrookdale by Night, 1801, the Industrial Revolution was the practical consequence of the advance of science and the Age of Enlightenment. However, in the public's mind, it fused with Romanticism and the marvels of industry, combined with what could be seen as the fires of hell. This painting depicts Madley Wood or Bedlam furnaces, which belong to the Coalbrookdale Company. And this picture, which is now in the Science Museum, has come to symbolise the birth of the Industrial Revolution in Ironbridge. Ironbridge is next to Coalbrookdale. The blazing furnaces, the heat, the danger, all instill a sense of awe and terror. And these are feelings associated with what was called the sublime. Now, the sublime is associated with Romanticism and was described in the 18th century by Edmund Burke in a book he wrote, which compared the beautiful with the sublime. Now, we appreciate the beautiful with our aesthetic sense, but he was saying that the sublime is associated with our sense of awe and even terror. And we receive enjoyment from that when, in fact, we are not in any danger. So we can experience terror and gain enjoyment from it when we're not ourselves in danger. The painting shows sublime feelings associated with the scale of the blazing furnaces, the noise and the dangers associated with the production. And wealthy tourists would visit the site to experience these feelings. So it was combined the terror, the wonder, the awe they experience was combined with a feeling of enjoyment. We now come to Gothic horror as the inspiration for a new type of novel, the Gothic horror novel. Inspired by science, but making it clear the dangers of the uncontrolled pursuit of science. And this is the earliest illustration of the creature from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and the illustration is by Theodor van Holst. Now, Shelley wrote Frankenstein in 1816, which was known as the year without a summer because the world was locked into a long, cold winter and a wet summer caused by an eruption of Mount Tambora the previous year. That was in Indonesia, but it sent up so much dust that it shielded the sun around the world and changed the weather for the next few years, but particularly the following year, 1816. So Mary Shelley and her lover, later husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, visited Lord Byron at the Villa Diodati by Lake Geneva in Switzerland, 11 miles from a castle called Frankenstein's Castle. Now, the weather was so bad, cold and wet and dreary, that they retired to the rooms of the castle, sat around a log fire and amused themselves by reading ghost stories. And it was Byron who proposed they each write a ghost story. And unable to think of a story, Mary became anxious. But one evening, the discussions turned to the nature of the principle of life. And someone commented perhaps a corpse could be reanimated using galvanism. And it was after midnight before they went to bed, and unable to sleep, she became possessed in her imagination, and she beheld the story that became Frankenstein and started to write it. It became a sort of a waking dream as she wrote Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. This is The Ghost of a Flea by William Blake, 1819. Now, his friend, John Varley, who was a watercolour painter, a landscape designer and astrologer, encouraged Blake to sketch portraits of the people who populated his visions. William Blake had many visions throughout his life, from when he was a small boy. And altogether he produced 40 or 50 drawings of these visionary heads. Many are historical characters, kings and queens, but the most popular has always been this one, the flea. There's a simple sketch and this elaborate painting. Now, Blake claimed that while he was sketching the flea explained to him, the flea of his vision, explained to him that fleas were inhabited by the souls of bloodthirsty men, and these bloodthirsty men were confined to the bodies of small insects, because if they were the size of a horse, they would drink so much blood that most of the country would be depopulated. The flea's bloodthirsty nature can be seen from its tongue darting eagerly from its mouth, drinking from the cup that's carrying the blood it's drinking. Now, jumping back slightly in time to 1749, this is Strawberry Hill House in Twickenham, which is to the west of London. And this was the original inspiration for this whole talk, the Gothic Revival movement, which started with this building, Strawberry Hill House. The Gothic Revival was seen as a way of breaking free from the dominant neoclassical style, which was based, of course, on Greek and Roman architectural forms. The Gothic Revival revived what was regarded as a golden age of craftsmanship and faith, the age of the great cathedrals, associated with the Middle Ages and connected as well with romantic ideals, medieval knights and romantic love and so on. And you can see here in Strawberry Hill House the pointed arches, the crenellations, decorative patterns, finials, which are the ornaments at the apex of a roof or corner. You can see lancet windows, hood mouldings above the windows with their label stops. That's the cranked termination of the hood mould above the window, which is to prevent the rain running down onto the window. It was built by the writer and politician Horace Walpole, and he's the one who wrote the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto, which launched the genre and influenced countless later writers. And he championed medieval and Gothic art, and that shaped the tastes of many British intellectuals, artists and collectors. There is, by the way, another building around about the same time, the Temple of Liberty at Stowe House, which is a Gothic temple, also known as Temple of Liberty. And the gardens were intended to make a political statement, which is another angle on this that I thought I would mention. Many of the temples and monuments in the garden celebrate the ideas of the Whigs, a political party that favoured a strong parliament rather than absolute royal power. They also favoured religious tolerance, free speech, rule of law, expanding voting rights, reducing taxes, and the abolition of slavery. And the person who built this, Richard Temple, later Viscount Cobham, Stowe House is the country estate, his country estate, saw the Gothic as supporting these aims of the Whigs, because he associated the Gothic with ancient English liberties, the Magna Carta, English freedoms, English democracy, and so on. Now, the old Palace of Westminster, originally built in 1016 or started in 1016, burnt down in 1834. And there was an intensive debate about whether the new building should be classical, columns and so on, or Gothic. Now, the Gothic Revival had already started, as I've made clear, and many public buildings were already being designed in the Gothic style. Partly there was a new interest in the medieval period and Gothic tales and romance, such as novels being written by Sir Walter Scott. There was an interest as well in the picturesque as a new romantic aesthetic associated with ruins, medieval ruins, castles and so on. And also there was the writings of the respected art critic John Ruskin, and he associated medieval craftsmanship with morally superior way of life compared with the classical, which he saw as symmetrical and repetitive and built by slaves following rigid rules, whereas the Gothic was craftsmanship who did their own thing, and this was a celebration of the freedom and skill of the individual craftsman and was therefore morally superior. So in the end, it was thought by the committee that the Gothic was more true to the history of England, and so that's why you see the Palace of Westminster as it is today in this Gothic style. It was promoted as well, heavily promoted, by Augustus Pugin, and it was designed and built by Pugin and Sir Charles Barry in this perpendicular Gothic style. In fact, in the end, although Pugin had a lot of involvement, he wasn't particularly happy with the end result. He thought that it had been made too symmetrical by Barry. He once remarked, "All Grecian, sir. Tudor details on a classic body." I don't know whether I see it that way, but he felt it didn't go far enough in its use of the Gothic style of architecture. He was very, in fact, he wrote a book, Contrasts, or a parallel between noble edifices of the 14th and 15th century and similar buildings of the present day, showing the present decay of taste. So that the title makes his view very clear. He was calling for a revival of medieval Gothic, a return to the faith and the social structures of the Middle Ages. This is one of the plates from his book. And what he's doing here is comparing the 15th century at the bottom with the equivalent 19th century at the top. And you can see how at the top there are factories and rigidity, symmetry, and at the bottom it's all churches and craftsmanship and worship. You also see at the top in the foreground that I think it's 8-sided building inside a square enclosure is Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, which was a prison designed to allow a single watchman to see all the prisoners at once, to be able to manage the prisoners more cheaply. And the prisoners themselves were in the rooms around the outside of that octagon, and the watchman was in the centre tower, and the prisoners couldn't tell if they were being watched. Their rooms were open on the inside to being viewed. They could be seen through the bars of their cell. No panopticon was ever built, although the marshy site on which Tate Britain now stands was actually selected and purchased to build a panopticon, but in the end a prison was built there, but it owes little to Bentham's ideas. The prison actually held prisoners before they were sent to Australia. It was a holding prison. Now, the Gothic Revival, which I said developed in Britain, became a standard architectural style through most of the 19th century in England. But it didn't catch on the continent to the same extent, although, as we see here, the French architect Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc praised the Gothic style and did incorporate Gothic elements in his buildings and restorations, although he often added his own interpretations, and so it wasn't the strict Gothic that Pugin was calling for. These buildings were constructed started mid-19th century. There was also a Gothic revival in the US. On the left is Richard Upjohn's early success with his Trinity Church in New York City, and that led to many commissions for churches, houses and offices in this Gothic revival style. In fact, he was so wedded to the idea that the Gothic style was the true representation of his Christian beliefs that he actually refused to design a church for the Unitarians, as he considered them unchristian or anti-Christian. In the 1850s, James Renwick on the right was the famous architect in New York City. Although he had no formal training in architecture, he was a prolific builder, designing hospitals, houses and apartments. And this is his most well-known building, St. Patrick's Cathedral, the largest Gothic Revival Catholic cathedral in North America. And although work was halted during the American Civil War, it was completed in 1878 and dedicated on May the 25th, 1879. By the 1890s, the Gothic Revival movement had been replaced by arts and crafts. But in the 1890s, many people's thoughts during the fin de siècle were turning to degeneracy. And one of those people was Bram Stoker, who was a business manager for the Lyceum Theatre in London. And he supplemented his income by writing sensational novels. His most successful was this one, the vampire tale Dracula, published in 1897. Set around, or parts of it set around the town of Whitby, where he spent his summer holidays. And he spent a long time. I think he spent 7 years researching European folklore and stories of vampires. And there were stories of vampires. There was an essay in 1885 on Transylvanian superstitions that included information about the vampire myth. And Dracula wasn't the first. In fact, 26 years before, there was a novel published about a lesbian vampire. And the first mention in English literature was 100 years previously. And we move on to the point where Gothic horror collides with reality, with the First World War. And one of the artists to respond was Paul Nash with this ironically titled "We Are Making a New World," showing what was a wood turned into wasteland. And it was shortly after the war that T.S. Eliot published his long poem, The Wasteland, and the first section is called The Burial of the Dead, themes of despair and disillusionment. It starts with the famous phrase, "April is the cruelest month." This is Nash's first major painting and perhaps his most famous. It has been described as one of the best British paintings of the 20th century, and it's been compared with Picasso's Guernica. Now, after the war, I thought I should show you Grant Wood's famous American Gothic. Grant Wood, was an American artist. He'd trained in Europe and he was being driven around Eldon, Iowa, when he noticed a Gothic window in a flimsy frame house you can see behind them. And he thought at the time it was a form of borrowed pretentiousness, a structural absurdity to put a Gothic-style window in such a flimsy frame house. And he used his sister Nan as a model, and his dentist, Dr. Byron McKeeby. Now, Nan was embarrassed by the implication that she was the wife of a man twice her age, and told friends that Wood saw it as a father and daughter painting, which he later confirmed in a letter, perhaps to keep her happy. Key elements of the picture reflect this emphasis on the Gothic, the long vertical man's face, obviously the Gothic window. And it's become one of America's best known paintings, but it only received third prize at the time when it was entered for the Art Institute of Chicago's prize exhibition. One critic called it a comic Valentine. A lot of people were furious because they thought the picture was making fun of the pinched, grim-faced, puritanical Bible thumpers of Iowa. Wood denied that. He denied it was a caricature, but it's now, I think, seen mostly as a satire of small-town rural life. Which brings us to the end of this little story of the Gothic. I thought I'd finish with modern Gothic and this Black Sabbath album cover that was released in 1970, their debut album. It received negative reviews by critics, but became a commercial success. The photographer was Keith Macmillan, and he designed and photographed the cover. The mysterious woman was Louisa Livingston. She was an 18 or 19-year-old model, and the building at the back is a 15th century watermill in Mapledurham in Oxfordshire. The spooky, eerie feeling was achieved by obviously the selection of the location, but also he used Kodak infrared film, and he said a little bit of tweaking in the chemistry to get that slightly dark, surrealistic, evil kind of feeling to it. And that brings us to the end of my little Gothic revival and Gothic history. My intention has been to show how the ancient Gothic tribes, the Germanic tribes, the Goths, had cast their spell over the whole of Western art. So thank you again for watching, and I hope to bring you another chunk of Western art soon. Thank you.